afternoon. First, thanks to both Wendy and Evan, who truly are two of my favorite people. So it's a joy to see them together in the same virtual room here. I teased Evan yesterday that the audio version of a recent New Yorker piece he did on U.S.-China relations clocks in at about an hour and 20 minutes. So we're going to challenge him to tackle a lot of related issues in a pretty tight time frame today. In the spirit of what Wendy alluded to, I'd like to start a little off theme by just giving Evan a chance to establish a sense of time and place. Some of Evan's followers, close followers, may have read his very thoughtful encapsulation this week of these remarkable days in America. Now, for those who don't know, Evan is originally from Greenwich. I'm wondering if you could briefly tell us, Evan, where you are right now and what the atmosphere there has been like in recent days.
Sure. And first, I want to say thanks to you, John, for doing this with us today, and to Wendy for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with people who are thinking about these kinds of issues, and of course also because of the connection to my hometown. So this is a pleasure many times over at a moment when we could use them. I think I'm talking to you today from Washington, D.C., where I live with my family, my wife, and we have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they may, some of the younger set may come into the room during this, so I would just warn you in advance. It is, last night, my wife and I went down before the curfew in Washington to go look at the site of Lafayette Square in front of the White House and St. John's Episcopal Church. It's a place that I know well because we jog down there. You can run from our house right down to the front of the White House. And for the first 7 or 8 years that we've been living in Washington, you could run right down Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House, turn the corner, and come back north up the hill to where we live in a neighborhood called Adams Morgan. And the reason I mention all this geography is that one of the things that's really striking about the White House is actually its physical orientation compared to the seat of power in a lot of places where I've lived, Beijing or Cairo, for instance, where it tends to be that authority is secluded. Oftentimes you quite literally can't see the place where the leader lives. And one of the remarkable things about this country is that the people's house, as it was known and as it was envisioned, is a physically open-faced place. And I've heard from Chinese friends and tourists and people from all kinds of other countries, when they come to Washington, the thing that that's quite remarkable is coming upon the front of the White House and realizing you're standing at a fence that is right in front of that place, and being quite taken with that. And that is not the case right now. It is even before there's a fence that went up around the White House this week. But before that, the fence, I should say a fence around Lafayette Park. But before that physical enclosure has been growing. And I think in some ways it is, there's a metaphor for the way in which we do feel right now. Many people, I think it's safe to say, feel alienated from American government and from how we are conducting our democracy. And whether you support this president or oppose him, there aren't a whole lot of people who feel as if we're living up to the kind of democratic system that we imagine ourselves to have and that we want to have. So that's what's on my mind as I'm talking to you today from Washington, and it connects in some obvious ways, I suppose, in some other ways, to the subject of China and the United States and our place in it.
Thanks, Evan. We'll move on to our theme, and I'll remind our viewers they can send questions that we'll tackle in a little while through the Q&A function here. But on our theme, can you talk about how there are considerable domestic challenges in China, how are those affecting its approach to dealing with the United States right now?
Well, and I'm just checking here to make sure my volume is okay. I think it may be that you're not hearing me enough. Hold on one second.
I can hear you.
You can. Okay, well, we'll have our, let's see. Wendy, if you sent me something, I'm afraid I can't see it now, but I'll keep talking, and if you send me something again, I'll see it.
There are a couple people who've sent me messages saying that your volume is low. Can you check your audio settings?
Yeah. Here,
And
let me call the IT guy. That's me.
Yeah, that's you. And increase the input level, or just click automatically adjust volume.
It's now further.
Getting messages much better. Yeah.
All right, great.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, folks. If only everything will be so easy to fix of what I'm going to say. I would say a couple things. John, you're absolutely right. You know, it's worth pointing out that, okay, sure, we obviously are having moments of we're having domestic challenges in the United States these days. In China, and it's easy, I think this is a kind of overarching comment for a lot of what we'll talk about today, which is it's very often easy to look across and say, well, they must be sitting pretty in this moment. They must be feeling quite confident on their side of the Pacific, because after all, we look like we're consumed by our own domestic dramas. China has a long list of domestic challenges, beginning with the most immediate, which would be that they are now in the midst of an economic, it's fair to say, not quite the economic crisis that the United States is facing, though it's hard to know. Let's point out the obvious. Sometimes statistics from China's economic agencies are unreliable. Sometimes they're okay. You can track over time, and if the changes over time are consistent, that tells you where to set your reference point. But we know by independent analysts that China's economic growth was probably down sub-zero by 9% in the first quarter of the year. That's a huge difference. That's the lowest economic activity that they've had since the Cultural Revolution. So that is a huge, which ended in 1976. So that's a huge fact, because if you're the leader of China, the single greatest priority you have is to keep every new generation of college graduates getting into jobs, because the fundamental bargain of that political relationship is you allow us to rule and we will allow you to gain some traction and presumably advance your quality of life year after year. And if that economic engine grinds to a halt, that makes it a lot harder. Other issues which are sort of widening out, they still face the risk of more public health challenges. COVID was and is, COVID came, after all, from a moment not just in China's public health culture, but its political culture. It's worth pointing out, this is not an unfair criticism. People in China are making this observation themselves, that had the state moved faster to acknowledge the original inception of the virus, to acknowledge that it was beginning to grow, to talk more publicly and seriously about it, that they would have been able to prevent the scale and spread of the pandemic. So those pre-existing issues are still there. And then the last thing I would mention is, there are a whole range of financial issues we could talk about, debt and so on, but I actually think the bigger one, if you talk to people in the China field, both on our side and on the Chinese side, they talk about the risk of environmental crisis. There are now, whether we're talking about water, air, soil pollution, those kinds of issues are sort of lurking in the background. And if you had asked me a year ago, what is the kind of exogenous shock to the Chinese system that we're not talking enough about, I wouldn't have said a pandemic. I would have probably said something like the water supply for a major city becoming unusable for a period, those kinds of issues. But I think if you add those together, those are the kinds of things that keep Xi Jinping up at night.
I wanted to ask you how the recent events in Hong Kong has become just a constant ticking clock. How are these events in Hong Kong, what are they doing to inform us about the potential future of Taiwan?
Well, it's in some ways, it's worth pointing out the structural differences and similarities. So Hong Kong, as we all remember, returned to Chinese territory in the late 90s under the terms of the agreement with the Brits. Under a 50-year plan, China was going to, in a sense, allow the existing political system to remain in place while gradually enveloping the economy and bringing these two systems into greater agreement. Obviously, the dispute right now is that people in Hong Kong believe that China has violated the nature of that agreement, that they have too quickly brought the Hong Kong political system into something closer alignment with Beijing, violating the notion of the sort of, two systems, one country plan. Taiwan is in a very different place. Taiwan, after all, lives in this kind of sort of unacknowledged political nether region between China and the rest of the world. It is obviously formally still part of China. It has not formally declared independence, but it is ruled by its own government, and it exists in quite tense distance from Beijing. And what I would say is that the people in Taiwan, what the question is really getting at is essentially, what are the events in Hong Kong? What do they actually tell us about what might happen in Taiwan? So Taiwan right now is at something of an interesting and somewhat fragile moment. The Communist Party, since 1949, when it took over in Beijing, has more or less allowed this sort of unspoken semi-autonomous, semi-independent status to continue. And Xi Jinping is quite clearly uncomfortable with that status. He has talked very explicitly about the fact that as long as Taiwan is separate from the mainland, as long as it is not part of the territorial integrity of China, that China has not returned to the full greatness that he imagines it should have. And so when he talks about maintaining territorial integrity and restoring or rejuvenating China, you have to see a potential narrative for Taiwan in there that is worrisome for people in Hong Kong. Whether or not Xi Jinping, to be explicit, whether or not Xi Jinping would make the moves to try to retake Taiwan by force or take Taiwan by force, that's a longer conversation. I don't think at this moment they would try to do it, but they are moving in that direction. And what the events in Hong Kong over the last year or so have shown us is that if there were people in Taiwan who wondered whether they could do a one country, two systems arrangement, basically whether they would go down the Hong Kong road of coming up with a kind of semi-autonomous arrangement within the Chinese political system, they have seen that doesn't work out very peacefully, and that China's conception of what that means may not match what the territory's conception of autonomy would mean. And I think it's undermined support in Taiwan for building a closer relationship with Beijing. It's actually kind of emboldened particularly young people in Taiwan to want to stake out a more autonomous position, to move further away from Beijing. So that's building up some of that electric energy, that kind of tension beneath the surface between these two.
The Chinese diplomats have adopted a more aggressive posture, which has been shorthanded as wolf warrior diplomacy after a movie you've written about. Can you explain for our audience the strategy behind that approach?
Yeah, and it's an interesting little cultural fact to understand what the wolf warrior diplomacy means, what it's referring to. There was a movie a few years ago now, that became the most popular movie in China. It was the most popular movie they'd ever had in the box office, and it was Wolf Warrior 2, which was a kind of, for those of you who may have missed Wolf Warrior 1, but Wolf Warrior 2 was a kind of what looked to be a fairly standard kind of shoot 'em up movie in the summertime, the kind of, box office fare we're used to, actually clearly registered something quite deeply in the audience's sensibility, which was the story was about China becoming a bolder, more muscular presence around the world, and not just asserting its own interests and defending its own claims, but also helping other countries. That in the plot, a sort of retired Chinese soldier along the lines of sort of a Chinese Rambo type is able to go out and help people in this case, it was an African country that's undergoing civil unrest and an epidemic, as a matter of fact, as the story had it. And they're able to bring those people aboard a Chinese ship and bring them to safety. And the movie became just a huge sensation in China. and has come to refer to a new mode of, a new posture in how China approaches not just its diplomacy, but its dealings with the rest of the world across, business and cultural realms as well. And that's a more, call it what you will, a more confident, to some a more overconfident position in seeking to assert China's interests. For a long time, anybody who covers China will know that the operating philosophy of U.S.-China relations and China's relations with much of the world was an ideal that was laid down by Deng Xiaoping, where he called it hide your strength and bide your time, which meant basically avoid inflaming the sensibilities of the United States, the sole superpower after the Cold War, and consistently build up China's power over time. Xi Jinping's a lot less comfortable with that. He's ready to try to establish China as a peer of the United States in many domains. And we can burrow into the details of that if you want, but that's a huge change. The idea that China is no longer waiting its turn that's sort of the fundamental fact of China's diplomacy today, and the source of a lot of the tension with which it's encountering as it goes out into the world, as it tries to stake out that bolder position.
Now, it's hard to ask you any crystal ball questions because the crystal ball is shattered. But I can't imagine President Trump holding back from continuing to blame China for the coronavirus on the summer campaign trail. What's the international fallout from that? How does China play into this pending political season?
Well, the pandemic, I think a fair accounting of China's role in the pandemic has to reflect two facts. So we have to be able to keep two thoughts in our head at the same time. Number one is they mishandled the origins of the pandemic. They simply did. All of us have heard about that heroic doctor, Dr. Li Wenliang, who became a hero in the Chinese people's eyes because what he did was try to raise alarms when he saw this new virus emerging in his city in Wuhan. And he was arrested. People know the story. He was arrested. He was brought in. So that silencing. And then there was a crucial period of about 6 days between the time that the government knew of the severity of the virus and when it actually publicly acknowledged it. And during that 6-day period, the normal commerce of human affairs, people coming and going, leaving, coming from Wuhan, having dinners. There was a huge gala banquet in honor of the Chinese New Year. All of that contributed to the spread of the pandemic. And there has been some research that has tried to estimate the scale to which the number of cases around the world would be lower if China had moved faster to deal with the pandemic. And then the second thought is it then responded very effectively, and it was confident in its application of control. And so they were able to bring down their number of cases very, very fast using good testing, good contact tracing, a lot of things that other countries would envy right now. And when you take those two facts, what do they mean for China? They mean that China is now, to use the title of our event today, trying to shape the narrative. And they're going out around the world and saying, okay, don't pay attention to the first half of our experience, pay attention to the second half. In some cases, they're using what's become known as mask diplomacy, where they're literally sending PPE and other supplies to countries that need it, in Europe, elsewhere in Asia, all around the world. And some of that will help, and some of that probably won't work because people will still feel as if China was putting its political priorities first. But it has contributed now, and we could probably sustain a whole question on that subject of the American political campaign. It has now slotted into this really this very tense moment in American politics about who is closer to China, who is tougher on China. You now have the Trump administration very actively seeking to draw attention to China's role in the pandemic, to say that it was not an American failure, it was in fact a Chinese failure, and so on. I think that a fair accounting of that is obviously that, sure, it was a Chinese failure, but the US federal response was inadequate in all obvious ways. And it's an attempt to shift blame by putting too much focus on the Chinese role. The Biden administration, the Biden campaign is also now starting to turn some of the keys on China and say, all right, let's bring that into our advertising. You're going to see China as a main character in the upcoming presidential campaign, and it's not going to go away. It's going to become a feature.
As the United States retreats from the World Health Organization, what does it mean as China and others fill that vacuum?
Well, it's interesting. The decision to retreat from the WHO, which began with cutting off funding and then eventually sort of announcing that we're severing our institutional relationship, which is a process that's a little more complicated than it's sometimes projected from the White House. That at the moment when the WHO is in most demand around the world, that's a choice that is quite dramatic. It reflects not just frustration with the WHO's handling of the pandemic, but also it's an extension of what has been one of the Trump administration's core ideas from the beginning, going back to its campaign days, which is the United States is spending too much and doing too much for other countries and should recede from multilateral institutions and agreements. And this is an expression of that. It just happens to be one that is particularly acute. China is responding to that with delight, frankly. It's an opportunity for them to stake out a greater position in these organizations, which in many cases were conceived by the United States, stood up by the United States, sustained by the United States. China is more than happy to move into that space. I think it's worth adding a point that is, this will kind of resonate more with people who focus on China every day, but we have a lot of discussions in the sort of analyst crowd about how much is China filling the void left by America's kind of America First era, where we're moving home in some ways. And the answer is that China is aspiring to fill the void more than it is actually succeeding in filling the void. And that's because at the core of global leadership is trust. It's how much do these other countries, other players, stakeholders, how much do they trust that when you, a global superpower or a leader, are moving into those positions of leadership, that you're doing it out of a desire to advance global interests rather than your own personal interests? The answer is right now, a lot of countries look at China and the United States and they say, we don't trust either of you, frankly. I will quote Kevin Rudd for a moment, former Prime Minister of Australia, a very thoughtful observer of both the United States and China, now lives in New York, speaks fluent Mandarin, knows the terrain. And he says the truth is that China and the United States will come out of this pandemic period, not with a simple tilting of the balance of power from one to the other, but frankly, both are diminished. And that is an era that we're contending with now, where we have two superpowers that are less dominant than they were before. If you want to talk about who has handled this pandemic period most effectively, it's not that authoritarianism somehow came out on top. What you've actually seen is that some smaller democracies, places like Germany, Israel, South Korea, Taiwan, they have all performed extraordinarily well in this period. And that is worth studying in greater detail instead of sort of reverting to what we sometimes do, which is assuming that one or the other superpower was the winner.
I saw an interview the other day where you mentioned, and your quote was, "There is no meaningful discourse going on between the United States and China. I'm not speculating. I know that for a fact." How do you contextualize the relationship from a historical perspective?
Yeah,
that's a stunning statement.
Well, you're absolutely right to draw attention to how remarkable that fact is as a measure of our moment. I have a lot of dealings with Americans who work inside the State Department, the national security apparatus. That's part of my day-to-day work. And a lot of those folks who work on China are people who I've known for a long time. The nature of the U.S.-China relationship has always been that even when there was tremendous turbulence on the surface of the water, that you had this sort of stable current running beneath it, where just the regular commerce of interaction between people at the State Department, people at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in downtown Beijing, that they were having a reasonably civil and robust set of communications. And that has just withered. it's much less robust than it used to be. It's tense. It's more confrontational. There was, under the previous administration and under the Bush administration before that, a series of these special dialogues that were set up, called them the Special Economic Strategic and Economic Dialogue, and there were other versions of that, which were dozens, if not hundreds, of these kinds of special channels where you would have an American and a Chinese interlocutor, and the two of them would be responsible for some esoteric piece of global affairs that they were trying to collaborate on. This administration has shut down most of those channels. And so what's left is mostly a trade negotiation channel. That's where most of the work is getting done. Meaning the people who work for Liu He on the Chinese side, who's the minister in charge of dealing with a lot of these trade negotiations, and mostly it's Steve Mnuchin and the USTR on the US side. But that is a far cry from what usually is this kind of fire hose of communication going on, even between two countries that consider themselves rivals, if not outright opponents.
I'm going to, in a moment, turn over to take some questions from the audience. So please send them through the Q&A function. Before we jump there, though, I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn, because I know for some audience members, there's an elephant in our little virtual room here, is your recent New Yorker article about Greenwich, about your hometown. When we first talked about this forum, you replied something like, U.S.-China relations, come to think of it, have a few things in common with the conflict in Greenwich politics. Can you share some of the feedback you've gotten from your hometown?
I will. In fact, actually, now that you mentioned it, I hadn't thought of it, but in the mail this week, somebody sent me a sticker from Todd's Point, a memento from home, from a reader who enjoyed that story that I published in the New Yorker. And I think, the impression I get is, as you would know, John, well, from your sense of the political scene and what people are writing and saying, that there is a tremendous amount of debate going on in Greenwich today about what politics should be and how we should be as a community, not just expressing our values, but also spending our money. So to put a finer point on it, I wrote an article in the New Yorker about the fact that Greenwich is a place that obviously in the general election in 2016 voted for Hillary Clinton. And what's remarkable, however, is that in the primary election, Greenwich voted for Donald Trump. And as somebody who grew up there, was kind of reasonably aware of our political history and the culture, I thought of it very much as the original terrain of Prescott Bush, a sort of moderate Republican, very much somebody of the sort of, the iconic country club Republican. And to then find that we had moved into a place where people were putting their votes behind Donald Trump, who is in no ways, I would say, would fit the description of a centrist Republican or a country club Republican in the way we used to think of them, meaning, Prescott Bush was to the left of his party on things like immigration, on birth control at the time, which was a big issue, on welfare, these kinds of issues. That's not where Donald Trump is. And I wanted to understand that passage. How did we get from one to the other place? And I've gotten a ton of response from Greenwich, some people who love that portrait, some people who hate it. And that's a good sign from my perspective. It's better to be talking about these kinds of things in an open, robust, and civil way than it is to sort of be quietly not talking about what we stand for and what we stand for as a community. So I say this is but I don't want to pretend it's not tense. The story happened to come out right at the moment that people in Greenwich were starting to talk about education funding. And it felt, I think, to some people as if the decision to cut funding from education in Greenwich was an extension of the kinds of values that they don't like about the Trump administration. So these two things became fused, I think, in people's minds.
So now I've got some questions from the audience, and I'll again remind people you can send questions through the Q&A function. My son's been knocking on the door to try to get some questions, and I'll try to get his. The first one we have is, given that U.S.-China relations with its periodic tensions, which you've discussed, which have been exploited at times for political reasons. Do you have any thoughts on how we can decrease the backlash against Americans of Chinese, or, and this is fair, more broadly, Asian descent?
And I want to make sure I heard it right. The question was, how do we reduce the backlash towards Asians among Americans? Is that the idea?
Yes.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out, I think people who may not have been seeing these reports, that there has been quite a remarkable, very disturbing uptick in attacks on Asian Americans and Asians. It's not abstract. It's been registered by the organizations that keep track. Many verbal attacks, in some cases physical. You can find that information online. I've written about it in a couple places and talked about it. I think part of the problem at the moment is that we're seeing a lot of sloppy political talk from the top, where when we describe this virus, as the president has, as the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, that's not the term that the WHO uses. It's not how we talk about things generally when we're talking in a context of being professionals in the world of science. So that makes it easy for people to begin to put this at the foot of individuals who have nothing to do with it. And we can do better. Those aren't the values that we tend to represent. But if you're interested, if you're concerned about attacks on Asian Americans, there are organizations that are following it closely, and this is something that is worth calling attention to.
Here's another question. From a reader who says, I read McMahon's Great Wall of Debt. He makes a convincing argument that China has a looming financial debt problem. You mentioned that at the top.
Yeah.
Can you please comment as to whether you support this interpretation?
I don't think it's a controversial view to say that China's debt is a serious risk. I mean, by all the usual metrics, it has a huge amount of debt, both at the local level, individual housing, all the way up corporate debt, and local governments especially. I think one of the things that's useful to keep in mind, one of the reasons why China's system may not follow the same kind of contours of a debt crisis that we're used to in our country, is that in the end, China exerts extraordinary control over its financial system. It has control over the banks. It has control over capital flows in a way that other countries don't. And it is one of the ways that it's been able to push off what everybody would have predicted to be a debt crisis. This is something that, I could have had that exact question 4 years ago, and people would have said, why is it that debt has not crippled China's economy yet? And it's because in the end, the Communist Party does exert extraordinary control, and they're aware of the problem. Are they honest with themselves about it? Not always. At this point, I think you would have to make a strong case that they would find themselves unable to use the levers of control that they've had over the last few years in order to sustain the argument that it's going to take them off the cliff.
Here's another audience question. What are the long-term implications of China building and financing infrastructure projects in, quote, less developed countries, such as African countries, where the United States seems to be taking a back seat?
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch this happen. I mean, if you're not following it in real time, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which we sometimes hear mentioned in passing, is a dramatic infrastructure push. It's on the scale, it's larger than the Marshall Plan that the United States introduced after World War II. And this is physically seeding Chinese infrastructure inside countries all over the world. And in some cases, these are pieces of infrastructure that these countries desperately want. So we're talking about a highway or a hospital or building some kind of rail facilities. In other cases, though, it begins to feel to those countries as if it is a trap. Either in some cases, it's a debt trap where they find themselves trying to service debt that they simply can't afford. You've seen that in Sri Lanka and other places. And that ends up then engendering a huge amount of backlash. And in other places, it also has just come off as feeling overly controlling. There's one thing that I think is hard to see from far away is that if you go around Asia, especially in the neighborhood, China has this uphill climb facing it, which is that for hundreds of years, thousands in some cases, these are countries that have perceived China as the great potential bully in the neighborhood, and they're worried about that. So, we've only been around the United States from their perspective for a few hundred years. We're sort of the new guy on the block, and they worry about us, but they've been worrying about China in Vietnam and in North Korea and in South Korea and elsewhere in the region for literally hundreds and thousands of years. And so as a result, when China miscalculates and goes too far too fast on the infrastructure push, that agitates a whole lot of pre-existing political wariness and can end up doing them more harm than good. I think if you had I've had conversations with people in Beijing over the last few months about the Belt and Road Initiative and this infrastructure campaign, and people there basically say, the problem was we came in too fast, too heavy. We generated all these antibodies, but now we can't walk away from it because Xi Jinping is personally associated with it very strongly. So what you're probably going to see is it'll continue. Nobody's ever going to back away from the Belt and Road Initiative. All they do is they just build a new slogan on top of it. That's the usual rhetorical technique. So you may find that it's no longer the primary instrument of assertion of state power. There may be something new coming. But it's substantial, and it's not going away.
Here's a question I'm glad somebody brought up because it was on my list as a potential wrap-up too. Do you think China seeks to be a dominant power in world affairs, a superpower, or will it mostly seek to achieve regional neighborhood dominance? Is it more concerned about its neighborhood or the world?
It's such an interesting question. I actually think it's sort of it's kind of the heart of the matter for us in the U.S. as we think about how to deal with China in the years ahead. Because the basic question is, where do they see us factoring into their future? Do they see themselves replacing us, supplanting us as the primary superpower in the world? Or do they see themselves carving out this zone of control within the context of a world that is, in which they are kind of superpower roommates with the United States? I think the temptation for us is twofold. One, we look at the China today and we say, well, it's a replay of the Soviet struggle where they were seeking to supplant us, to destroy our primacy, if not our system. And that's, I would say that's a congenial view in Washington because after all, people love to look back on the Soviet struggle as a model because we won that one. That's it's like asking the Mets if they want to go back to the '86 Mets. Yeah, of course they do. I think that's probably the most controversial thing I'll say today. The point is that actually the Cold War analogy can really, I think, distract us more than it illuminates. There is a lot about the fact that the U.S.-China struggle is real, it's sustained, it is deep. This is not, a small issue that's going to go away. But for us to assume that China's success is our failure is an analytical error. And anybody who knows the Chinese system closely will tell you that. And people who deeply disagree on a lot of other matters. Henry Kissinger and a Yale professor named Arnie Westad, who is one of the great scholars of Chinese foreign policy, both of them have said to me in the last year, it's a mistake to see this as a replay of the Cold War. And those two don't agree on just about anything else. My point is that China seeks above all to return to the system of control it had in Asia for most of its history. That in itself is a reason for concern for us because we have security alliances, guarantees with countries in the region that we simply cannot walk away from, whether we're talking about South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere. But let's talk about that. Let's not take that and inflate it into the idea that we're facing a zero-sum civilizational conflict with China, because that's just bad analysis.
All right, our next question. Do you think President Trump's tariffs and trade war will be effective in changing China's policies on technology transfers and control of joint ventures?
It's an interesting question. I think China's perspective is, I think they treat these things as slightly separate buckets. They are willing to cede ground on trade, on tariffs. They see that as a kind of That's the local weather when it comes to the relationship. And they'll give up some here or there. They signed this trade agreement in which they agreed to buy huge amounts of commodities. Whether or not that happens is another question. But this larger question of whether they would in fact grant real substantive greater market access to American companies, would they allow joint ventures a greater degree of independence? Would they stop the forced transfer of technology? That's more sensitive, and they're not willing to make those kinds of hard commitments. The reason it's more sensitive is they see that as a primary avenue through which China continues to build and avoids the middle income trap. So what China is willing to give up is the bucket of stuff that does not from its view, does not fundamentally contribute to its long-term growth necessity, which is it cannot afford economically or politically to stagnate. Stagnation is political risk. And so its view is that the solution is to grow out of the problem and to try to get to the point where it's a first-tier technology power. And so it's going to be very slow to give up those kinds of preferential advantages. And that's going to be a source of conflict between the United States and China.
Okay, folks, we've got about 15 minutes left. So remember, the Q&A function is collecting questions for Evan. And our next one is Chinese President Xi seems to be departing from the, quote, opening up approach of his predecessors, clamping down instead. What's your view on this?
This is just a huge change in global affairs of the last 8 years. It's almost the kind of, probably you could argue it's the biggest change in global politics that we don't talk about every day, because we're talking about 1/5 of humanity that is living under a system in which it was for a long time moving very haltingly and one step forward, two steps back kind of thing towards a system of greater integration with the rest of the world on the most basic level. I mean, just to give you an example, you had more Western movies coming into China. You had more Western books coming into China. You had every university in the United States that was worth its salt was looking for ways in which it could try to bring over more Chinese students and bring over more American professors to China, bring over more American students, get them exposed to that kind of relationship. And Xi Jinping has a fundamentally different view of China's future with the United States. It just does not see Western influence as a source of strength. It believes that it's actually a risk. So it is, to put it in direct comparison, Deng Xiaoping believed, as we all remember, that in order for China to thrive, it had to open a window to the world. And as he and his generation used to say, when you open a window, some flies will come in. But that's, in a sense, that's manageable because you need that oxygen. Xi Jinping's view of history is very different. He looks at the Soviet Union, he looks at the Soviet experience, and he says the mistake they made was by letting in too much Western influence, by caving to that ideological atmospheric pressure. And our solution, our way not to go the route of the Soviets, is to prevent that. And so that's why they have cracked down as they have on not just dissidents and people who criticize the regime, but Western literature and Western constitutional law. If you're a constitutional law professor in China today, it used to be that you relied on these Western texts as one of the ways that you taught people about what it means to be a lawyer. A lot of those books have been replaced, and they've been replaced by things that conform more dutifully to the Chinese political system. I mentioned that example. It seems like a small example, but it is reflective of this much larger turn in the way that China has oriented itself towards the rest of the world. And one of the areas where obviously I have differences with the Trump administration on a lot of the ways it's gone about its China policy. But one point that they sometimes make, and I think it's a valid one, is that it's not that the Trump administration started decoupling from China. Actually, the decoupling process, this kind of pulling apart, began before. It began when China did things like prevented Google and Facebook and the New York Times and BBC from being able to operate in China and being able to reach an audience there. Those kinds of decisions were a form of seclusion, and what we see today is an extension of that.
Our next question, and I like that they preface this by saying this may be from left field, and I don't think you will think it's from left field. Question is Confucianism a rising factor in China?
You know, I think Confucianism is, it operates on two levels in China. And, you know, for people who haven't sort of followed this kind of thing, I'll put it in very literal terms. In Beijing, I lived for a number of years right next door to the Confucius Temple in the center of town. This is a temple that's been there for 700 years, that stands for celebrating China's most famous philosopher. And when I first moved into the neighborhood, it was a pretty sleepy joint. I mean, there just wasn't a whole lot going on. The Confucius Temple attracted a few tourists and, you know, poets, but there just wasn't much happening. And then after a few years, after Xi Jinping came to power, you began to see that the Confucius Temple was suddenly kind of coming alive. There were all these activities there. There were tour buses coming, bringing Chinese visitors in. And part of what was happening was that Confucianism, and we'll sort of broaden that to say classical thought, traditional Chinese philosophy, had become an instrument by which the current Chinese leadership was trying to enhance its own legitimacy. So they were saying, you know, they were basically saying, look, we don't just draw our values and our inspiration from the revolution in 1949. We draw our inspiration from the full ancient roots of Chinese philosophy. And they were trying to kind of, you know, piggyback on that moral credibility. And some people went for it. Other people said, this seems like a cheap political trick. I'm not convinced that you actually have all that much in common with Confucianism. But there's been something else that's going on, which is that there has been so that's the top-down version. The ground-up version is that a lot of people, particularly young people in China, are really looking for greater meaning, spiritual meaning in their lives. This is a country that has transformed itself physically and economically. I mean, just in the 25 years I've been working on the topic, its economy has grown 24 times over. So put it in those terms. And at the same time, it has hollowed spiritually. You know, this is a country that in many ways destroyed its spiritual infrastructure during the Cultural Revolution, quite literally burned down the temples. I mean, the Confucius Temple right next door to where I live was destroyed in many respects. And that's an overstatement. It was damaged, and people were brought there, and it became a site of China's kind of spiritual self-destruction. And what you see is young people are desperately looking for inspiration, and they're not finding it from the current realm of political offerings. They're finding it by looking into their past and saying, you know, who are we as a culture? What do we stand for? What are my commitments to my neighbor? What are my commitments to my society? What are my commitments to government? What do I expect from what do I expect from government? And that's a much more robust form of Confucianism. So that is a really strong and in some ways much more uncertain tide, because that's not one that the government is able to control quite so easily.
Our next question, that's a good one. Do you have any thoughts on China launching its digital cryptocurrency and how that might affect the United States and the US dollar as a dominant currency?
It's not a subject I know a tremendous amount about, but I have a few basic principles that I think are useful in thinking about it. One is, you know, for a long time, China has aspired to have, to try to make the renminbi into a global reserve currency. And it's still a ways away from that, because that's not just a series of formal maneuvers. That's also about building global trust, so that people feel as if actually they are able to move their money in and out of China as freely as they would like, and so on. And that hasn't happened. And in fact, China's moving in the other direction. I will point out, though, and this is kind of the broader context to our conversation today, that as the United States looks less stable in the eyes of the world, and any reasonable accounting would show it does, that does shift attention to the possibility that China becomes a place that people look to as a power of last resort. I'm not willing to say a lender of last resort, but it is a place that people think of as an alternative to the United States. At the moment, though, China and the United States, as to go back to the earlier point, which is probably the single greatest takeaway from our conversation today, is neither China nor the United States are showing themselves to be reliable, predictable stewards of global security at the moment. And that extends also to financial security. So I would say, yeah, digital cryptocurrency, but China is going to seek, one thing you can be absolutely sure of, the one other principle I would mention on this is, before China was in favor of a cryptocurrency, it was deeply suspicious of cryptocurrency. It doesn't like the idea of anything that can be used and with an anonymity, that it can be used outside of the bounds of the state control. And so I think, you know, you can assume that it's going to be much more controlled by the state than it would be in another country. And for that reason, it's less likely to inspire confidence among people who go to a cryptocurrency precisely because they want that level of independence and anonymity.
And as our clock ticks to the end, Wendy has thrown me one last question here, and then I'll let you turn it back to Wendy after answering this. What are your thoughts on the extent of legitimacy that the Chinese government gets from its people?
This one is it's a great question. It's in some ways, it's more legitimacy than people in the West might assume. I think, you know, we look at the Communist Party and we think, you know, this looks like a propagandistic enterprise that is this kind of tin-eared organization. How can they really generate much sympathy and support from their public? Simple fact is, Chinese people have been so poor so recently in their history that they do to this day, for all of the dysfunction and shortcomings of the Communist Party, and I can give you a long list, I've written about it for years, they still credit it with having improved their lives on a basic level. And that, if you were trying to draw a single appraisal, stays true. You know, there was a period earlier this year when we looked at their handling of the pandemic and said, is this the moment when people lose faith? And the truth was, they were angry. They questioned the legitimacy of the party. But the ability to then restore some competence changed the narrative, and they lived to fight another day. But I will add one other thought on this, just a sort of final concluding thought is relevant, is one of the hardest things to know about China is to measure public opinion, to know what people know in their hearts. What do they really believe? Because of course you don't have reasonable independent polling of the kind that we have in our country. You don't have the polling at the ballot box the way we do in a democracy. And frankly, you know, the turmoil that we're seeing in the United States today, the public protests, the level of anger and dissatisfaction, some people on the other side standing up for the Trump administration, all of that is how we understand the political temperature and the mood in our country. China keeps a lid on that activity, and therefore we don't really know what public opinion is. The last time that that the world saw public opinion on full display in China was, in fact, the anniversary was yesterday, 1989 in Tiananmen Square. And China made it, essentially the Chinese government said, we'll never allow that happen again. And so what they do is they live in some uneasy tension with their own public opinion. They don't particularly want to allow it full expression, or they might not like what they see. I'll end it there, and thanks very much for the questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Evan Osnos and John Brunig. A really broad conversation there, and as it stands right now, 41 questions were submitted. So I want to thank our amazing audience. There were so many great questions in there. We could have done another hour, but we'll keep it to an hour because everybody lives on too many screens these days. Thank you so much for coming into our homes today and having this important discussion. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Okay.